The first light of dawn painted the sunny sky in pale hues of orange and purple, stretching endlessly over the vast, silent plains. In the center of this immense emptiness stood a solitary structure, a weathered wooden ranch house that seemed to cling to the earth as if afraid the wind might carry it away. A thin wisp of smoke curled from its stone chimney, the only sign of life against the sprawling canvas of the awakening day. Inside, Ethan stirred. His movements were slow, deliberate, etched into his bones by 60 years of the same routine. The bed creaked as he swung his legs over the side, his feet finding the cold floorboards with practiced certainty. He dressed in the semi-darkness, his hands moving automatically to the worn denim and flannel that felt like a second skin. The house was filled with a deep, resonant quiet, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the methodical scratch of a match as he lit the old cast-iron stove. He moved through the small, cluttered rooms with a quiet purpose, each action a ritual performed 1,000 times before. He poured water from a heavy ceramic pitcher into a tin coffee pot, the sound loud in the stillness. As the coffee began to simmer, he stepped out onto the porch, the rough wood gritty under his bare feet. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. His eyes, pale and set deep in a face lined like a surveyor's map, scanned the horizon. There was nothing to see but the rolling grasslands, the distant, hazy outline of mountains, and his own few head of cattle, dark specks against the golden grass. This was his kingdom, the ranch he called the Silent Pine, a kingdom of one. After a breakfast of black coffee and hardtack, his day's labor began. He spent the morning mending a section of split-rail fence that had sagged under the weight of winter snows. The work was physical and absorbing. The rhythmic thud of the mallet driving the wooden pegs into place was a familiar percussion in the symphony of his solitude. Sweat traced paths through the dust on his forehead. He spoke to no one, his communication limited to soft grunts of effort and occasional, low-spoken words to his old bay gelding, Samson, who stood patiently by, swishing his tail at the flies. The horse was his primary confidant, a silent witness to his thoughts. Later, he tended to the small vegetable garden, his gnarled fingers carefully pulling weeds from around the stubborn potato plants. His movements were economical, devoid of any wasted energy, the movements of a man who had long ago accepted that every ounce of effort was his alone to give. The afternoon sun was high and hot when he took a break, sitting on an upturned crate in the shade of a lone ponderosa pine that gave the ranch its name. He pulled a worn, sepia-toned photograph from his shirt pocket. It showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her hand resting on the shoulder of a much younger, smoother-faced Ethan. His thumb, rough as sandpaper, stroked the image of his wife, Clara. A deep, familiar ache settled in his chest, an emptiness that the vastness of the plains could never fill. The photograph was a portal to a different life, a life with laughter and conversation, a life that had ended too soon. He returned the picture to his pocket with a sigh that was swallowed by the immense silence around him. As evening approached, he led the cows to the small barn for milking, the sound of the stream hitting the bottom of the bucket a steady, hollow rhythm. The chores were a chain that bound his days together, each task a link that kept the loneliness at bay, if only for a little while. He ate his supper of beans and salt pork at the small wooden table, the clink of his fork the only noise. The silence in the house was a physical presence, heavy and thick. He tried to read from a tattered Bible, but the words often blurred, and he would find himself simply staring out the window at the deepening twilight. The purple shadows lengthened, swallowing the land, and the stars began to pepper the velvety black sky, cold and distant. He sat on the porch one last time before turning in, a solitary figure silhouetted against the warm light from the doorway. The yipping of a coyote pack echoed across the plains, a lonely sound that mirrored the one in his own heart. It was just another day, ending, identical to the one before it, with no reason to believe the next would be any different. The universe was vast, and he was a single, small point of light within it, burning quietly, seen by no one. The change on the wind was subtle, a scent that did not belong. It was smoke, but not the clean, sharp smell of a controlled brush fire or a neighbor's hearth. This was thicker, carrying the faint, acrid hint of burned hides and something else, something ominous that made the fine hairs on Ethan's forearms stand up. He had finished his morning chores and was sharpening an axe near the barn when he first noticed it. He straightened up, his old joints protesting, and scanned the horizon with a practiced eye. To the west, a thin, gray smudge marred the clear blue sky, too distant to pinpoint, but close enough to warrant caution. He spent the rest of the day with a heightened awareness, his movements more deliberate, his ears straining for any sound beyond the ordinary. The feeling of being utterly alone, once a constant and heavy blanket, now felt like a vulnerability. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was pregnant with waiting. The next morning, the evidence was undeniable. He found the tracks near the creek that bordered the eastern edge of his property. They were not the prints of deer or the pad marks of a wandering wolf. They were moccasin tracks, many of them, overlapping and pressed deep into the soft mud by the bank. His hand tightened on the rifle he always carried when checking the far pastures. He followed the trail, his heart a dull drum in his chest, a mixture of fear and a strange, grim curiosity taking hold. The tracks led away from the water and towards a thick copse of cottonwoods. It was there, in the dappled shade, that he saw them. A group of 10 figures huddled together, their dark eyes watching him without blinking. They were Apaches, their clothes worn and dusty, their faces etched with a profound exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. He saw a man with a broad, strong face, whom he would later think of as Howling Wolf, standing slightly in front of the others, one arm cradled awkwardly against his side, a dark stain visible on the deerskin wrapping. There were women with tired, resigned expressions, and children who peered out from behind their mother's legs, their eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. For a long minute, nobody moved. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the cottonwood leaves. Ethan's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. Decades of ingrained suspicion and stories of frontier violence screamed at him to raise the weapon, to shout, to drive them off his land. But then his gaze fell on the children, on the obvious pain in the lead man's face, on the utter lack of aggression in their stance. They carried no visible weapons. Their hands were empty, open. Howling Wolf took a single step forward. He did not speak. Instead, he gestured to his own chest, then to the group behind him. He pointed back in the direction from which they had come, then swept his hand in a wide arc, mimicking riders. Finally, he brought his hand flat against his own heart, his dark eyes locking with Ethan's. The gesture was simple, universal. It was a plea for sanctuary. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He looked from their desperate faces to his quiet ranch, his sanctuary of solitude. The silence stretched, broken only by the nervous stamp of Samson's hoof behind him. Finally, with a slow, deliberate movement, he lowered the rifle. He did not smile, did not speak. He simply turned his head towards the old, unused barn that stood 100 yards from the house and gave a single, curt nod. The days that followed the Apaches' arrival settled into a fragile and unspoken routine, a cautious dance of coexistence on the hard-packed earth of the ranch. Ethan's initial act was one of pragmatic separation. He carried a dented tin bucket to the well and placed it precisely halfway between his porch and the barn, a silent offering of water and a clear demarcation of territory. For the first 2 days, the Apaches were phantoms. He saw only hints of movement in the barn's deep shadows, but the bucket was emptied and returned each evening. The silence from within was profound, a disciplined quiet that spoke of a people skilled in the art of invisibility. The first crack in the wall appeared on the 3rd morning. Ethan returned from checking a fence line to find his haphazard pile of split firewood had been res-tacked into a neat, symmetrical cord, the logs interlocked with an efficiency he admired. It was a silent message of reciprocation. That evening, he left a sack of potatoes and a wedge of cheese by the bucket. The next morning, the food was gone, and on his porch sits a pair of expertly crafted rabbit snares made of woven sinew. A slow, wordless dialogue had begun. Ethan noticed tools left out were cleaned and placed in the shade. He found a patch on his trousers, sewn with stitches finer than any he could manage. The true thaw came with the well. The old oak bucket had split. Watching Howling Wolf and the others examine the problem, Ethan saw not threat, but analysis. He brought out a coil of rope and a leather bucket, laying them on the ground as an invitation. What followed was a day of silent collaboration. The Apache men worked with focused economy, cleaning the pulley, splicing the rope, fashioning a new hook. Ethan assisted by fetching tools, the shared purpose transcending language. By sunset, the well was functional again, better than before. That night, Ethan cooked a large pot of stew and carried it to the halfway point. He ate alone at his table, but the shared meal, consumed in separate spaces, felt like a signed treaty. The next morning, the young brave Ethan thought of as Hawk's Eye approached, holding a frayed harness. He spent an hour showing the youth his repair methods. Hawk's Eye watched, then took the tools, his nimble fingers reinforcing the leather with a complex, beautiful braid that was stronger and more elegant than the original. In return, the young man later led Ethan to a hidden game trail, showing him how to set the snares for a clean catch. No words were exchanged, but a foundation was being built of action and observation. The ranch was no longer just Ethan's. It was becoming a shared territory, its air now carrying the faint scent of their campfire and the sounds of their quiet industry. The rhythm of cautious coexistence that had begun to define life on the ranch was shattered with the visceral suddenness of a slamming door. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration in the earth, a sensation felt through the soles of the feet rather than heard by the ears. Ethan was in the corral, running an oiled rag along the leather of Samson's bridle, the familiar task of comfort in the late afternoon sun. He froze, his hands stilling on the worn leather. It was the sound of approaching horses, but not the casual, plodding gait of a single rider or the scattered movement of wild mustangs. This was the purposeful, synchronized cadence of a group moving with intent. Samson's head came up, his ears swiveling forward, and he let out a soft, nervous whicker. A cold knot of dread tightened in Ethan's stomach, a primal alarm that bypassed thought. His eyes, narrowed against the sun's glare, scanned the main trail leading to his property. He saw them then, 3 riders materializing from the shimmering heat haze, their forms solidifying into distinct shapes. The man in the lead was broad-shouldered, and the star-shaped badge pinned to his vest caught the sunlight, winking like a malevolent eye. Sheriff Hollis. The 2 men flanking him were younger, their faces set in expressions of bored vigilance that did little to mask an underlying hardness. They represented the world of order and consequence, the very world Ethan had turned his back on decades ago. Every instinct screamed at him to look toward the barn, but he fought it, forcing his attention back to the bridle in his hands. He continued his slow, deliberate polishing, his movements measured to project an air of unbothered routine. He could feel, rather than see, the absolute stillness that had fallen over the barn, the faint sounds of activity that had become part of the ranch's new soundscape. The soft scuff of a moccasin, the murmur of a voice, vanished completely. It was a silence more deafening than any noise, a void filled with palpable terror. The riders reined in their horses a dozen yards from the corral fence, the animals stamping and blowing, their tack jingling in the sudden quiet. Dust motes, stirred by their arrival, danced in the slanting light. Sheriff Hollis tipped his hat back on his head, his gaze performing a slow, comprehensive sweep of the property. It was a lawman's look, missing nothing. It lingered on the main house, on the wisp of smoke from the chimney, then traveled to the barn, its doors standing partially open, revealing only deep shadows within. It noted the second clothesline strung between the barn and a post, holding garments that were clearly not Ethan's. It took in the garden, where the rows were unnaturally neat and weed-free, evidence of more than one pair of hands. Ethan finally looked up, meeting the sheriff's gaze with a carefully constructed mask of weary curiosity. He gave a slow nod, a non-committal greeting. The sheriff spoke, his voice a gravelly baritone that carried easily across the still air. He spoke of trouble to the north, of a skirmish between homesteaders and a band of Apaches. He mentioned a specific name, Howling Wolf, and the price that had been placed on his head. He talked about finding a recent campsite a few miles east, the signs pointing to a group of 10 or so individuals moving with purpose. Ethan listened, his face impassive, while inside his mind raced. He leaned against a corral fence, crossing his arms, the picture of a tired old man mildly inconvenienced by this intrusion. He had to lie, and he had to lie convincingly. He spoke of the land's openness, its unforgiving nature. He talked about the coyote packs that could confuse a trail, the deer that moved through in numbers. He deliberately steered the conversation toward the hardships of his solitary life, the poor price of beef, the relentless wind, anything to paint himself as a man concerned only with his own survival, a man too isolated to be a part of anyone else's conflict. He could feel the seconds stretching, each one an eternity. The weight of the hidden lives in the barn pressed down on him, their fear a tangible force. He saw the deputy with the lean face studying the ground around the barn, his eyes sharp. The sheriff's gaze returned to Ethan, and for a long, heart-stopping moment, their eyes locked. Hollis was weighing his words, his instincts as a lawman warring with his knowledge of Ethan as a stubborn, private individual. Finally, with a slow nod that seemed to convey both acceptance and a lingering doubt, the sheriff gathered his reins. He issued a final warning, a reminder of the danger and the reward, before turning his horse. The sound of their departure was a slow, fading percussion that seemed to last forever. Ethan did not move until the last echo had died and the dust had settled completely. Only then did he allow his shoulders to slump, the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding escaping in a long, shaky sigh. He walked to the water trough and splashed his face, the cold water a shock to his system. When he turned, wiping his face on his sleeve, Howling Wolf was standing at the entrance to the barn. Their eyes met across the yard, and in that silent exchange passed the full, grim understanding of their new reality. The outside world had found them. The ranch was no longer a refuge. It had become a fortress, and the walls were made of nothing more substantial than trust and a shared, desperate secret. The tension that settled over the ranch after the sheriff's visit was a thick, suffocating blanket. The wordless collaboration ceased. The Apaches retreated back into the shadows of the barn, becoming phantoms once more. Ethan went through his chores with a heightened alertness, his ears straining for any sound that was out of place, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The shared meals ended, replaced by a return to solitary rations. The easy, silent understanding that had begun to flower was replaced by a watchful, fearful waiting. 2 days passed in this nerve-wracking limbo. Then, on the evening of the second day, the threat finally manifested. They came not from the main trail, but from the east, riding out of the gathering dusk with a quiet menace that was more terrifying than the sheriff's official visit. There were 5 of them, mounted on lean, tough-looking horses. They were not lawmen, they were hunters, and their profession was etched in their hard faces and the well-cared-for rifles that rested across their saddles. They fanned out with a practiced efficiency, 2 moving to cover the front of the house, to the barn, and 1 remaining slightly back, a lookout. The air grew cold and heavy with the promise of violence. From a crack in the barn wall, Ethan could see the dark shapes of the Apaches inside. They were not panicking. Instead, they were moving with a grim, resigned purpose. He saw Howling Wolf checking the edge of a knife, his face a mask of stoic acceptance. The women were gathering the children into the deepest, darkest corner of the barn. They were preparing for a last stand, a fight they could not possibly win. A desperate plan, born of his intimate knowledge of every inch of his land, crystallized in Ethan's mind. It was a gamble, a long shot, but it was the only chance they had. He needed to create a distraction, a big one. He caught Howling Wolf's eye and gestured for him to look through the crack. He pointed to himself, then toward the hill where a large, dry haystack stood, a dark shape against the twilight sky. He then made the motion of striking a match and the spread of flames. He saw the understanding dawn in Howling Wolf's eyes. Ethan then pointed to the Apache leader, then to the women and children, and finally traced a path with his finger toward the dry creek bed that ran behind the barn, a natural trench that wound its way up into the foothills, invisible from the front of the property. Howling Wolf gave a single sharp nod. The plan was set. As full darkness enveloped the ranch, Ethan moved. He slipped out the back door of his house, crouching low and using the shadows of the woodpile and the outhouse for cover. The journey to the haystack felt like miles. Every crunch of gravel under his boot, every rustle of grass, sounded like a thunderclap in the tense silence. He reached the base of the hill and crawled the last few yards on his belly. The hay was tinder dry from the summer sun. His hands trembled as he struck a match, shielding the flame with his body. He touched it to the base of the stack. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a tiny flame licked at a strand of hay, caught, and spread with terrifying speed. Within moments, the entire stack was ablaze, a roaring pyre that lit up the night sky, casting long, dancing shadows across the ranch. Shouts of surprise and confusion erupted from the hunters below. Their attention was instantly, completely diverted toward the sudden, dramatic fire. This was the moment. Ethan saw dark, silent figures flowing from the barn's rear entrance, led by Howling Wolf and Hawkeye, shepherding the women and children into the protective darkness of the creek bed. His part was done. He began to crawl back down the hill, but a shot rang out, the bullet whining past his head. A searing pain burned across his shoulder as a second shot found its mark. He stumbled, biting back a cry, and slid the rest of the way down the slope, gritting his teeth against the pain. He fired his own rifle twice into the air, the reports adding to the chaos and pinning down the hunters' positions. By the time the men realized the fire was a diversion and converged on the barn, they found it empty. Their furious shouts and the sounds of them ransacking the building echoed in the night. Eventually, their curses fading into the distance, they withdrew, defeated not by force, but by cunning. Ethan, clutching his bleeding shoulder, leaned heavily against the doorframe of his house, his eyes fixed on the dark line of the creek bed. They had made it. A wave of exhaustion and relief, so profound it made his knees weak, washed over him. The wound on his shoulder was a sharp, burning ache, but it was a clean pain, a price paid willingly. The ranch was silent again, but it was the silence of escape, of a battle won without a shot being fired in anger, only in sacrifice. A week passed. The gash on Ethan's shoulder, which he had cleaned and bound himself, was a clean, angry line, but was already knitting together. The flesh around it tender, but free of infection. Life on the ranch returned to its old rhythms, but the silence was profoundly different. It was no longer the empty, resonant silence of solitude, but a quietness filled with echoes. He performed his chores with a mechanical efficiency, his eyes constantly drifting toward the barn. The space felt unnaturally large and empty now. The absence of the others was a physical presence, a hollow space where a nascent community had briefly flourished. The woven basket they had left sat on his table, and he found himself running his fingers over its intricate patterns each time he passed. The garden, though still tidy, seemed to wait for hands that were no longer there. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and fiery orange, a movement on the distant hill caught his eye. A lone rider sat motionless on the crest, silhouetted against the dying light. Ethan's hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning by the door, but then he stopped. There was a familiar stillness to the figure. The rider urged his horse forward, descending the slope at a slow, deliberate walk. It was Howling Wolf. He rode right up to the porch where Ethan stood and dismounted. His face was calm, etched with the same quiet dignity Ethan remembered. Without a word, he walked forward and presented Ethan with a large, carefully folded bundle. It was heavy and soft. Ethan took it, the material yielding under his fingers. It was a bison robe, its hide supple and deeply furred. Howling Wolf gestured for him to open it. Unfolding it, Ethan saw that the inner side was adorned with magnificent beadwork. In the center was a tall, green-beaded pine tree. Circling it were 10 stylized wolves, each one unique, running in an endless loop under a beaded sky of midnight blue and silver stars. It was a story, a history, a map of their souls, and a gift of immeasurable value. It was a testament. Howling Wolf placed a hand over his own heart, then pointed to the robe. and finally to Ethan. The meaning was unmistakable. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back toward the hills without a backward glance. Ethan stood for a long time, the weight of the robe heavy and warm in his arms. He carried it inside and hung it on the wall opposite the fireplace. That night, as he sat in his chair, the firelight danced across the beads, making the wolves seem to run and the pine tree to sway in a silent wind. The solitude remained, but the loneliness was gone. It had been filled, replaced by the enduring echo of a shared humanity. The ranch, the fences, the lone pine tree outside, they were all the same, yet everything was transformed. The boundaries of his world had been stretched to include the memory of 10 wolves who had, for a fleeting season, found shelter under its branches. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of a story, and he was its keeper.